And we are recording. All right. So welcome, everybody. And we'll do some quick introductions just so we know more about each of our companies. But one of the nice things about this format is that we can make this very interactive and specific to your company. So in like a big webinar, I have to be very generic about everything. And there are things that I want to share with you and teach, but I also want to make sure that we can apply this to your specific situations and answer questions that you have. And that's the value of this being a smaller, more interactive by design group. So just by way of introduction, Tammy, tell me about your company. What is your company? What do you do? How many people are there?
Yeah, so Tammy Williams, I'm the VP of Culture and L&D for Capital Credit Union. We are 2.3 billion. We've got 470 team members and 24 branches.
Wow, excellent. Cool. And Pam and Tim, tell me about your company.
Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Pam.
We are a steel service center here in Hamilton, Ohio. I'm the human resource director, but we have 3 divisions. So we have 2 divisions here in Hamilton, and then we have a kind of like our sister company that's spread in the southern part of the United States. We're all steel integrated. We have about 115 employees combined with all 3. And we just became an ESOP last year.
Okay, great. And when you say steel service, describe for me what that would look like. What would be an example?
So we're actually kind of, if you think about the middle guy, we purchase large steel coils from, like, for example, what used to be AK Steel or Cleveland Cliffs, large manufacturers of steel, and then we cut them down. We have the tools and the machines to cut down that steel to whatever our customers are then going to take that in turn into their final product. We've got quite the variety of customers, pretty well diverse across different industries, to kind of help weather whatever industry is going on.
Cool.
With like, for example, the UAW strike. You know, we weren't too heavily vested just all in automotive, so we have other areas, construction, home building, stuff like that.
Okay. And Tim, what's your role there?
Yeah, operations and safety. Heavily involved in operations and quality too. So wear a lot of different hats. So Pam did a nice job describing kind of what we do at McCandy. So yeah, excited to be here. Great.
Super. And Brenda? Yep, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I'm with in Clover Research. We do it's kind of like Whole Foods supplements for pets. So all kinds of animals and zoos and any kind of animal we do. Yeah.
And how many people are there?
So we are just 15 people, but we're the supplements world, you know, is just growing like crazy. So I'm really anxious to learn more about it. I'm the managing director. So we have a founder, and then I run the company for her. She's a chemist, so we're doing more projects. And I need to know how to keep our culture while we're just skyrocketing right now. So I can't wait to learn.
Great. And DJ?
So I'm a solopreneur, brand strategist and advisor. And when you define brand the way that we do as trust and reputation, culture becomes immediately apparent and why it's so important. My firm is Stereo Brand Agency. The left channel is culture, right channel brand. When you get those 2 things in sync, some pretty divine things can happen for business and organizations.
Cool. And where are you physically located, DJ?
Suburban Detroit, between Detroit and Ann Arbor.
Okay, cool. And what are your typical clients? Is there a certain type of client that you typically work with?
Well, before I started working for myself 20 years ago, I came up through not agencies, but through nonprofit and kind of mission-driven organizations. So I think the entrepreneurial leaders that I tend to gravitate to are people who everybody says they're purpose-driven, but if they had to prove it in a court of law, wouldn't be able to. So I think the people who genuinely come to their claim of being purpose-driven, where they're entrepreneurs who they want to make money, but that doesn't totally scratch the itch. Those are my people.
Got it. Okay, cool. Excellent. So let me just sort of frame how we're going to do our time together. So I want to give you an overview of how I think about and teach culture. And I'll give you a quick little background in a moment. And then get into the guts of, okay, how do you systematically create and embed the culture you want everywhere in your organization? So as you were describing, Brenda, as you're growing fast, we don't lose the things that made us special when we were small. And when you're already larger, like let's say Tammy, you got 400 and some people with lots of different locations. How do we create that consistency across all those locations so that you work at our credit union, there's a way we do things here. And I'm going to show you the methodology for doing that. From a logistics standpoint, we got 2 hours. We'll take one break in the middle, just because that's a long time to be sitting staring at a screen. So we'll take one break in the middle. And let's make this, again, intimate and interactive. And so anywhere you have a question, I can see you. So that's why being on video is helpful. Just raise your hand and we'll just jump in and make it very interactive. One thing that helps with that, in my experience, is that actually, unless you're in somewhere that's noisy, if you keep your mic live as opposed to on mute, you're more likely to jump in with a question, or I'm more likely to ask you something, and just kind of, instead of having to fiddle, oh darn, where I gotta get off my mute thing. So again, if you're in somewhere that's noisy, okay. But otherwise, if we stay on camera and stay live to our mic, we can make this that much more interactive. So very quick little background I'm in the Philadelphia area, Southern New Jersey, and I spent 27 years building, it was an employee benefits consulting company that I grew from a couple people to well over 100 people. And all of the success we had in that company was based upon the culture that we had built in that company. It's completely what made us successful. And as the CEO of the company, I did a lot of things in a very intentional way to create that culture and to make it so successful. I eventually sold that company to a large multi-billion-dollar publicly held company. I retired from that industry. And after I retired, I wasn't sure what I was going to do next, but I ended up writing my first of several books about the things we had done that made us so successful. The first book was called Fundamentally Different. And I wrote that book, honestly, as a closure step, as a way of wrapping up my career in a nice bow, putting it behind me so I could go do something completely different. And little did I know what would happen is that people that read that book asked me to speak. And as people heard me speak, people said, hey, that's pretty interesting. Could I hire you? And next thing I knew, I was in my second career. And so in the last, I've done over 800 workshops on this material over the last 10 years. I've written 3 books on it. We've worked with more than 800 companies in every industry under the sun, helping them implement this particular methodology that I created. And so I give you just that brief background, mostly to say that everything I'm going to show you in this session comes from my experience as a CEO, having created it in my company and having taught it to so many thousands of leaders. I always tell people, if you have humans in your company, this works for you. If you don't have any humans, it won't work. But you got the human types, it'll work. So it's very practical stuff. So the foundation of everything that I teach people is the recognition that the culture in any organization, whether it's a for-profit or a nonprofit, whether it's a white collar or blue collar, whether it's remote or hybrid or a physical, brick and mortar place, that the culture has an enormous influence over every single thing that goes on. There's a story that I share in a lot of my talks of an experience I had recently so I mentioned that I'm in Southern New Jersey, just outside of Philadelphia. And I fly it almost every week. I'm in some other city. And I'm home today, but I'm usually flying around the country. And Philadelphia, some might know, is an American Airlines hub. And so if you're flying out of Philly, you're going to be on American Airlines. And a few months ago, I was in Seattle and I was doing a series of talks in Seattle. And I was flying back from Seattle to Philly, and I was on American. And the only benefit of flying as much as I do is that I'm almost always upgraded to first class. And I was upgraded. And the flight attendant who was managing the first class cabin on that particular flight was a woman named Allison. And this woman, Allison, was unusually good. And I say unusually because, as I said, I was on American. And she did a number of things that created a very different experience. They were small things, but together they created a different experience. So the first thing she did is she introduced herself. Like, how often do people not even introduce themselves? I just find that kind of odd. She had the list of names of people that were in first class, and she went down the row and she went to each person and said, Ms. Williams, I really appreciate you being with us. Mr. Cape, is it Klepp? Mr. Klepp, I appreciate you being with us. Ms. Kaiserberger, thank you for being with us. And she thanked each person for flying on American. Philly being an American Airlines hub, there are many people who are flying to Philly are just going to be connecting to another flight. So she had the list of people that were connecting. And she, you know, as she went to each person and had a connection and said, Ms. Schwartz, I see you're going to be going to, you know, Detroit next. We're landing at C3. You're going out of D4. Do you know how to get there? And she just made sure everybody knew how to get where they needed to go. There was an older couple. I remember this. There was an older couple in the row in front of me. And this older couple looked a little confused, and probably 3 times during the flight, she went up to them and just reassured them to make sure they knew what to do when we landed in Philadelphia. There was a, when it came time for the meal, I could demonstrate this if I were physically with you, but she got down at our eye level as she looked at each person and said, hey, Mr. Harula, you know, would you like to have lunch with us? Here's what our options are, instead of looking down upon us. I mean, small thing. When we got off the flight, she had memorized everybody's name who was in first class. So I was watching this. She was not looking at any piece of paper. And as people got off the flight, she thanked each person by name for flying with America. I mean, she was just really, really good. Well, a few weeks ago, I was in Chicago, and I was flying back from O'Hare, which is where you always have to connect for me if you're going to Green Bay like Tammy. And O'Hare, I think, is about the worst airport in the whole country. And it's an American and United hub, as you probably know. And I was flying back from Chicago, and the flight attendant, I was upgraded again, and the flight attendant who was managing the first class cabin on that particular flight, this guy's name was Michael. And this guy, Michael, was perfectly ordinary. Like he didn't suck. He was just pretty average. He did the safety things the way they always do them. He tried to sell us a credit card, which they do on every American flight. When it came time for, it was too short a flight for the meal, but they had that snack basket. You ever see what the snack baskets are on the flights? And he went around with the snack basket and he stuck it in everybody's face. Like he didn't say, would you like a snack? He just stuck it in our faces. When it came time for the drink order, I'm a pretty big drinker. I had a ginger ale. And when he brought me my ginger ale, I said thank you to him. And he walked away from me. Like he didn't say, my pleasure, can I get you? He just walked away. When we were getting off the flight, I try to be pretty polite. And if the cabin door is open where the pilots are, if that's open, I'll say thank you to the pilots and thank you to the flight attendants. So as I got off the flight, I said thank you to this guy, Michael. And his answer was, uh-huh. Now, the interesting thing about this guy, Michael, is that if I rate himself on, let's say, a 1 to 10 scale in terms of his performance on that flight, Brenda, what's your guess as to what he would have rated himself on a 1 to 10 scale?
I say average or above average, maybe. I don't know if he was aware enough to know.
Yeah. What do you think, DJ? What do you think he would have given himself?
I mean, that guy's given himself a 10 because he is so lowly defined what a 10 is.
Yeah, I would suspect. Tammy, what do you think?
Yeah, I concur.
Yeah, that's I'm guessing similarly that whether it's, maybe if you didn't give it 10, he would have given it 8 or 9 at least. That I'll bet, much as you said, DJ, he lowly defined what excellence looks like. I'll bet he thought he did a really good job. In fact, if I were to have suggested to him that it wasn't very good, I'll bet he would have been astonished. What are you talking about? I checked all the boxes. I did what I was supposed to do. I think, this is just my theory, I think it didn't even occur to him that there was an Allison level of performance that was available to him. It wasn't that he was purposely mailing it in. It wasn't even in his mind that you could do the kinds of things that Allison did. And so here's the first question I want you to think about. If I were to interact with or even observe any of your staff, or in your case, DJ, some of your clients, whether it's Tammy, it's a teller working at one of the branches, or Pam or Tim, it's a guy in the shop, or maybe one of the drivers, or a warehouse person, or Brenda, maybe it's one of your salespeople or receptionist. If I were to randomly interact with any of those people, how confident are you that anybody that I interacted with would be an Allison versus a Michael? And would the chances that I get an Allison versus a Michael in your company mostly just be luck? I mean, we all have some people like that Allison, and sometimes you get one. Or is that the way your company does business? And maybe most importantly, if you had a way that you could turn most of your Michaels into Allisons, what would that be worth to the company? Because that's really what we're going to talk about here, is how could you turn most of your Michaels into Allisons? Because I would tell you that in my experience, the single most impactful thing that influences whether the vast majority of them show up like Allison or the vast majority show up like Michael is the culture in your company. That the culture in your company affects everything that goes on, not just your ability to attract and retain the kind of people you want, but it affects the pride they take in the quality of whatever it is that they're doing. It affects how they deliver service to whoever your customers may be, internal and external customers. It affects how collaborative they are with each other, how innovative they are. It affects how much money you make. It affects every single thing that goes on. You know, there's a story I tell often of where I come from. So I live in this town in South Jersey, as I said, called Moorestown, New Jersey. I'll show you a good background for this. So I live in this town called Moorestown, and Moorestown is it's a Quaker town founded in 1682. So it's a very historic place. And I've lived in this town since I was 13 years old. So that's a long time. And it's just kind of a strange place because a lot of people that I grew up with still live here in Moorestown as well. And I went to Moorestown High School, and Moorestown High School has always been known for one particular sport. Believe it or not, it's the sport of women's lacrosse. Lacrosse is very big in the mid-Atlantic states, more so than some parts of the country. And the women's lacrosse team in my town every year is ranked among the top teams in the entire country. Last year, they were like number 10, I think. And they went through, there was a stretch where they went through, in an 18-year period, they won 17 state championships in 18 years. They went through one stretch, they went 228 games in a row without ever losing to a New Jersey team. That's how dominant they are. And I find public high school sports dynasties to be a fascinating group of teams to study. You have them wherever you live. I know you do. They're everywhere. And they're interesting to me because they have two dynamics that make them unusual. The first is that in a public school, for the most part, you can't recruit. I mean, think about that. You're stuck with whoever happens to live in your town. So think about that in the context of your company. Imagine if anybody who came to you and said, Brenda, I would love to work for your company, you had to take them, got no choice. How hard would that be to build a great company? Yet that's what public high schools do. Secondly, think about this. In a school environment, you're turning over your roster every year, at least every couple of years as kids are graduating. So think about that again in the context of your company. If anybody who knocked on your door, you had to take them, and you turned over most of your team every single year, how hard would that be to build a great company? And yet that's what public high school sports dynasties do. So if you think about that, you think, well, then there's something going on there. And I don't think it's the water. I think what's happened is these teams, and again, you have them around you, these teams have built high-performing cultures, championship cultures. You're a woman in my town and you join that team, you immediately pick up a vibe or an expectation that, you know what? We play like champions here. And it causes people to elevate their game beyond what they might somewhere else. In fact, I'm convinced that if my family moved from Moorestown to Green Bay, where Tammy is, and my daughter went to some local high school and joined the lacrosse team, if they have one, I don't think she'd be playing at the same level. Now, it's still her. She didn't lose all her skills, but she's on a different team with a different set of expectations, and those expectations affect everything. And the same thing goes on in our companies. That if you think about your staff, and again, DJ, I'll refer to as your clients that you work with, if you picture your staff, my experience is you could plot most of them on a very typical bell curve. That on one end of the spectrum, we all have some Allisons. If that woman, Allison, left American Airlines and she went to work for any of you, I bet she'd be one of your best people. She just has it in her. She just gets it. It isn't American that's driving that. It's just Allison. And we all have some people like that. I call those people rock stars. On the other end of the spectrum, we all have some people who just aren't going to be very good. I don't care where you put them. They're just not. But in between, we've got about 80% of our people who are going to go with the flow. You put those people in a high-performing environment, and they're going to look around consciously and unconsciously and figure, I guess that's what they expect here. And they'll raise their level of performance to match what they see around them. And when we understand that, what that suggests to me is that as leaders, and it's why you're here, as leaders, if we had some way that we could be more purposeful or systematic about creating that championship kind of environment, that championship culture that would help elevate our performance, that would seem like a pretty smart thing to do. And yet, what's so interesting is how few organizations do. Most of us sort of live with the culture that happens instead of purposely creating the culture that we want. And I want to show you how to do that. Now, one of the general point I want to make, then I'm going to get deeper into this, and that is that every organization has a culture. Any of you not have a culture in your company? You can't not. You put people together, there's going to be a culture. Whether it's what you want it to be or not, it's a different question, but there's going to be one. Even a group of friends of yours has a culture. Think about a group of guys or women that you play golf with, or you're in a church group with, or you, I don't know, go fishing with, or maybe they're friends of the parents of your kids or whatever. There's a culture in that group of friends, an unwritten set of rules about how you guys and women relate to each other. Do you ever think about where that comes from? Like, I'll bet, Tim, you probably do this. I'll bet every year you and your friends go off-site, you do a retreat, you come up with a vision and a mission and some core values for your friends, right?
Not all the time.
No.
No.
But yet there's a culture in your group of friends, isn't there?
Correct.
I would think your Florida trips might be a little bit of culture building there, Tim.
It's been a while since I've been on one, so we might have to establish a new culture.
So where do you think that culture in your group of friends comes from? How does it get established?
I think the history would be one of your friendship that's been established over time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think, DJ, and your friends? Where does the culture come from?
The default culture comes from shared experience, sort of like attracting like, ultimately over a long enough time horizon. If you look at a friend group, the people that are going to stick in that friend group are the people who feel comfortable to be there. So essentially it's, if it's not cultivated, it can just be a race to the average, a race to kind of like, what do we all sort of agree to tolerate, or, what do you get when we're just ourselves together? And I think the other thing is proximity. It's just nearness. It's proximity.
I think that's a lot of it, but I'll add some nuance to that. So let me ask you this, anybody, picture your groups of friends. Do you think that everybody in that group has the same influence over the norms that get established?
No.
So tell me more about that, DJ.
Well, I think depending on how you're wired, you're either wired to sort of easily make decisions and lead and have sort of a take charge, or you have a potentially healthy codependent relationship with somebody who does and outsource sort of your decision making. And it's, there's leaders emerge and followers emerge. And
I think you're exactly right. Yep, I think it's just, and I think exactly as you described, DJ, it's just your wiring. It's not good or bad. It's just we all have different personalities, and some are more leaders and some are more followers. And the leaders typically have a disproportionate amount of influence over the norms that get established and reinforced in the group. They're the ones that, I don't know, we're getting together as a group and we're all going to go out to dinner, and somebody says, well, where do you want to meet? And inevitably somebody says, how about Abby's Bar and Grill at 6:30? Does that work? Like, who said Abby's Bar and Grill at 6:30? It was the leader of the group. And everybody else says, yeah, that's fine. I'm good with that. And these leaders tend to influence the group in a disproportionate kind of way. And the reason that I raised this issue for you to think about is that I would tell you that absent an intentional force on your part, in other words, if you're not purposely doing something about it, the exact same thing happens in your company. That the culture in your organization ends up getting mostly influenced by those people who just happen to have the strongest, most influential personalities. And those people, by the way, aren't necessarily the designated managers, supervisors, and leaders. They're just people with strong personalities. And if those people happen to be really positive, enthusiastic, hardworking, quality-oriented kind of people, like that woman, Allison, that I was describing in American, shoot, this will be great. Everything will work out fine. But what if some of those stronger personalities happen to be cynical jerks with lousy attitudes? And we've all had some jerks in our companies before. Let's just face it, we all have. those jerks are going to influence the people around them to be more like them. And the reason I raise this, of course, is if we understand the impact that our culture is going to have on virtually every aspect of the performance of our company, that's not something you just want to leave to chance and hope the right people end up influencing it. That's something we as leaders got to take control over and make the culture be what we want it to be. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do. Now, how do you do that? So I want to introduce you to a framework or a roadmap, a series of steps that it takes, in my experience, in order to purposely, systematically create and embed the culture you want into every part of your company. And I call this the 8-step framework. 8 different things that when we do these 8 things, this is how you pull it off. And while all of the 8 steps are important, and I'm going to go through all of them a little bit, my experience also tells me that if you really just cut to the chase, all right, get right to it, at the end of the day, there are 2 of the 8 steps that drive a disproportionate amount of influence over your success. In other words, if we do these 2 things well, we're going to be 80 or 90% of the way down the road to success. And if we don't do these 2 things well, we're just not going to get very far. So in the interest of our time, to give you the most value that I can in this 2-hour time slot, I want to talk about all the 8 steps briefly, and then I want to go back and I want to do a deeper dive on the 2 of the 8 steps that will most influence your success so that you can see how to start applying these concepts immediately in your organization. That's our game plan. Got it? All right. The first of our 8 steps is the most obvious of the steps, and yet it's got to be our starting point. It's one of the 2 that we're going to really focus heavily on. And that is that we've got to be able to define with tremendous clarity exactly what we want the culture to be. Now, the reason I say this is obvious, of course, is how could you go about building a particular culture if you can't tell me, well, what is it exactly that you're trying to build? Now, that's kind of obvious. And as obvious as that sounds, my experience is that very few organizations do this particularly well. In fact, I'll bet most of you have some, well, let me ask you if you do. How many of you have some written form of vision, mission, values for your company? Most do. And yet I would tell you most of the time, not always, but most of the time, it isn't all that helpful. It looks really good on the website, but it ends up to be kind of fluffy and not all that concrete and not clear enough. We've got to be able to define this much more clearly. I say that driving a culture more than anything is really a teaching function. It's what are you and the other leaders of your company teaching your people day after day after day? And if you don't know what you're teaching them because you've never defined it clearly enough, you're not going to do it that effectively. I think of it almost like a curriculum. If we could build a whole curriculum around our culture, we'd have a lot better chance making sure that all of our leaders are out there teaching the exact same thing to people, and we'd start to see a lot more consistency all across the organization. So one of the first things I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a different way, a new and a different way to define exactly what you want your culture to be and how to build a whole curriculum around it so that everybody's teaching the same thing. So I'm going to come back and do that. The second step, yeah, go ahead.
Will we get a copy of these 8, like your nice little slide that you had at the beginning of this, those 8 steps?
Yeah, I can figure out how to do that because it's actually not slides, they're just backgrounds. But I'll figure out how to get you some of that too.
Thank you.
And all of it's also in my book, Culture by Design. There's a deep dive on all of this too. Yeah. All right. Second step in our overall framework is one of the simplest things I've ever learned, and yet one of the most important. I call it creating rituals or ritualizing your practice. Creating rituals is all about how we make things last. Because we all have the experience in our companies rolling out new programs. I'm sure you've done this, where you've rolled out new programs that everybody was excited about, and then you got really busy. And you got a new customer, lost a customer, got a key person, whatever, and life got in the way, and it fell by the wayside and became yet another flavor of the month. Now, you guys have probably never done that, but you probably have friends who've done that. And candidly, if that's all that happens, it's just a waste of everybody's time. The key, we want to make sure that whatever we're doing is going to last for the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And the key to making something really last and being sustainable is this concept that I call creating rituals. So I'm going to come back because this is the second of the two big ones that we're going to go do a deep dive on. And I want to explain to you what a ritual is and why this is such a powerful concept to sustain your practice. Huge thing, simple, but really important. All right, the third step in the overall framework, I call it selecting. And what I mean by selecting is, how do we go about choosing the right people to join our team? And when I say the right people, I'm talking about people that are going to be a good fit for the culture that you're trying to create. Because we're never going to build a high-performing organization, high-performing culture with people who don't fit. It just doesn't work. You've all seen this. Looks like we've got another person joining us, Robert. We can almost see you, maybe, kind of. So we've got to be able to bring the right people in, because we're not going to build a great company with people who don't fit. You know, I say that when we're interviewing people, when people come and show up to maybe get hired by you, they're usually, I call them fully baked by the time they show up. Pam, what do you think I mean when I say they're already fully baked by that point?
I mean, that they bring their previous experiences, their previous work environments, their previous experiences with their supervisor or their coworkers or anything like that. They're bringing everything that made them who they are.
Exactly. Yeah. And you're not going to change much of that.
No.
Whatever it is they're bringing, it's who they are. They are who they are, put it that way. You know, you're not likely to take many people who aren't a good fit in your culture and expect to do some kind of an intervention and convert them into becoming a good fit. It doesn't work very often. It's possible, but it's really rare. We have to start with people who are already a good fit, because we're not likely to change the ones that aren't. Now, that's easier said than done. I mean, yeah, great idea, David. But we're never going to bat 1,000 at recruiting. We're just not. Let's just accept that. Tammy, you're in this business. You know that, right? We're going to make mistakes when we're hiring. We are. But I'll tell you, there's a big difference between the mistake that we make being, I interviewed this woman and I thought she was awesome. I mean, she looked like she had everything we needed. But it turns out I misjudged it. I didn't read the signs right. I didn't pick up on something I should have seen. That's going to happen sometimes. It will. I don't care how good we are. We're going to make mistakes. That, however, is a big difference between that mistake and the mistake being, I interviewed this woman and I knew she wasn't a good fit, and we hired her anyway. That's the mistake we have to avoid. And we've all done it. I've done it. And why do we do that? You've all done it. Why do we hire people we know aren't going to be a good fit?
To do the teller transactions.
Yeah. Usually we're desperate. We're short-staffed. I mean, right now, everybody's short-staffed. We're looking for people. We've been interviewing. We've been trying to find people. At some point, I got to fill that spot, we think. And so we bring in somebody who's not such a good fit, thinking we're going to deal with it later, which we end up dealing with it later. We end up getting rid of the person. And we got to clean up all the messes that got created in the meantime. And then we end up having to redo the hire again anyway. But it takes a tremendous amount of leadership discipline in the face of that real challenge to avoid that mistake. I mean, it's nice to say in the theoretical world, you should never do that. But we're running our companies in the real world. And the real world, we are short-staffed and we are desperate to find people. And we are so tempted, but we're never going to build the kind of company we're trying to if we do that. Sometimes I say it this way. Sometimes it feels like we're comparing this candidate to an empty chair. Compared to an empty chair, the guy looked damn good. But is he really what we needed? No. Got to be really rigorous about that. All right, the fourth step in the overall framework is something that I call integration. Integration is my word for what some people call orientation, or some use the new agey term that I hate. What do you call this?
You're not thinking of onboarding, are you?
I hate that word. Yeah, Pam, I hate that. It always sounds like waterboarding to me, Pam. And in some companies, it's not that different. But whatever words you want to use, it's the word that describes how do you take those people you just hired and how do you bring them into the company? The reason I use this particular word, integration, is I think it has a different connotation. Like orientation suggests I'm telling you about us. where integration is a word of assimilation. I'm bringing you into the fold. I'm making you a part of who we are. But I don't care. Use whatever word you want. The point is, how you do that actually has an enormous influence over your culture, enormous. I say to people all the time, if I went to work in any of your companies, I would tell you that the first probably several days to a week are just about the most important days in my entire career with your company. You think that's true, Tammy?
Yes.
Why?
I do, because at that moment, I mean, when you're going through that process, it's a really, you talk about the pride and passion component of it. They're in the process of really establishing what they feel about the company. So
Yeah.
how we bring them on board and is really, again, I'll use the onboarding word, but I love your word integration. It matters.
Yeah, those are the first impressions. And whatever the impressions they draw, whatever conclusions they come to, are really hard to change later, aren't they?
Mm-hmm.
There's an analogy I often use when I talk about the power of integration. And my analogy is I come to work for any of you guys, and imagine that I'm going to put a pair of eyeglasses on. And let's assume that those eyeglasses have a prescription lens in them. And based upon the prescription lens, I'm going to see things differently. I could look at, that 8-step framework drawing that I showed you before, and it looks a little different to me if I'm wearing Tim's glasses versus Tammy's glasses versus somebody else's glasses. Presumably you each have a slightly different prescription in your glasses, and the prescription is filtering or influencing my vision. You follow what I mean by that analogy? So I'm going to come in at the beginning and I'm going to put this pair of eyeglasses on, and it's going to influence everything I see. You have an opportunity from the very beginning to write the prescription for my glasses, to influence how I see or perceive or experience everything that's going to happen after this. I think of it almost like brainwashing in a positive kind of way. You get to brainwash me to see the world through the lens you want me to see it. And if you don't take advantage of that opportunity at the beginning, it's like allowing me to come in on the first day. And imagine there's a big, huge pile of eyeglasses sitting on the floor, and I close my eyes and I randomly pick one up and put them on. And who the heck knows what the prescription is? Or worse, what if one of those cynical jerks we talked about before with the lousy attitudes? What if a jerk grabs me on the first day? Says, here, David, you're the new guy. Here, put my glasses on. Let me tell you how things really work around here. You think that's going to have any influence? And good luck changing it later. It's not like 6 months later you could say, I know we got off to a bad start. Could we just hit the reset button and do it over again? Nope. Got one shot at this. And it's remarkable how few companies do this well. We spend so much money in recruiting to find these people. And so often we basically throw them to the wolves and say, good luck, let me know if you have any questions. If we spent a fraction of the resources that we spent in recruiting and we pump those back into orchestrating every aspect of that new person's experience, it would have an enormous influence over our culture. Huge opportunity overlooked by most people. All right, fifth step in our overall framework. I call it communicating our culture or making it visible. What I mean by that is all the different ways in which I can literally see what your culture is. Now, this is a place I want to be careful because I don't want you to misunderstand what I'm suggesting. I'm not suggesting that if we put some beautiful signs on our walls, if we have a physical space, that we're going to magically transform our culture. And we've all seen that stuff. Remember the old successory prints that everybody used to have? We had the guys rowing on the river and it said teamwork and the eagle flying and it said leadership. And I'd see these signs on people's walls. And then I'd look at their people and think, I don't see a lot of that happening here. So the fact that we have some beautiful signs isn't going to change our culture. However, if our culture is real, it's authentic, well, then the more I see it everywhere around me, the more it's influencing me. I think of it almost like internal advertising, that if the only time I ever saw like a physical written form of your culture was on the first day in the new hire paperwork sandwiched between the benefit enrollment forms and the I-9 is an 8.5 by 11 with your vision, mission, and values, and that's the last I've ever seen of it. Anything that has to do with our culture, how likely are we thinking about it? Not much. But if everywhere I look, assuming it's real, everywhere I look, I'm inundated with it, because it is on the walls. It's on screensavers and mouse pads. It's in the men's room above the urinals. And it's just everywhere I look, the more I see it everywhere, the more I'm thinking about it, the more I'm talking about it. Again, it's like internal advertising. Companies spend billions of dollars a year in advertising, right, DJ? Because it influences people. You know, the more people see it, the more it influences us. And again, this is not a replacement for the other things we need to do. It's just a really simple but important element of additional reinforcement to everything else that we're doing. And you're limited only by your own creativity and all the many different ways you can do it. Simple thing. All right, sixth step in our overall framework, I refer to it as coaching. When I talk about coaching, what I'm referring to is how you use the day-to-day situations that come up throughout your company to teach and reinforce your culture. In other words, you're going to hear me say this a lot today. To me, your culture isn't necessarily the signs on the walls. It's what your people are doing every day. It's the way they're actually operating every day. And every day, you and the other leaders of your company have lots of opportunities to give people coaching or feedback. A customer issue comes up, a vendor issue, an issue between two employees. And every time in that coaching, every time you use the specific language and the vocabulary of your culture in that coaching, you're pulling it off the wall or the website, and you're making it real and relevant and meaningful for people. Let me give you a really simple example to show you what I mean. My company's culture, which you're going to learn about shortly, is based upon a very specific set of behaviors that we teach in our company. One of those behaviors that I'm really passionate about, I call it honor commitments. Do what you say you're going to do when you say you're going to do it. So let's suppose we had a situation in which we had failed to do what we promised for one of our customers. And I'm giving DJ some feedback. And I say, DJ, just like it says right here on the wall, honoring commitments is one of the most important fundamentals of our company. So let's talk about what do we need to do for that customer to make sure we've honored every single commitment we made to them. Oh, now I see what you're talking about. So I could teach DJ the same thing, and it could still be a great lesson. But if I never use the language of honor commitments in that coaching, it didn't prevent it from being a lesson. I just would have missed a golden opportunity to connect the dots, to have DJ realize that that stuff we told you, DJ, when we hired you, and the stuff that's on our website and the stuff that's on our walls, that's not just signage. That's actually how we do things in our company. Every chance you get to use that language and vocabulary of your culture in the day-to-day coaching that you and others in your company are doing, you're pulling it off the wall or the website, and you're making this stuff real and relevant and meaningful for people. So many opportunities to do that.
We talk about that in terms of connecting the why to the how, right? Drawing a specific line between those two things.
Yeah, this is where you're showing. This is the how we do this stuff every day. Yes, we could talk about the why all day long, but what does that look like on a day-to-day basis? We got to draw those lines, and the use of the language is how you're helping to draw those lines. You could teach that same thing, but if you didn't use the language of your culture, you just missed a huge opportunity to connect those dots for people, to draw that line between the two. Yeah. All right, seventh step in the overall framework is something you know about already, but we still need to touch on it. And I call it leading by example, or your leadership example. What I mean by that is we could talk about this stuff all day, and we could put up all those great signs and everything else. But at the end of the day, what you and the other leaders in your company do tells them way more than anything else about what the real culture is. And I know, again, you know that that's not a new thought. But when you consider that, I say all the time that as leaders, all of us, one of our most important roles, it might even be our most important, is that every one of us is a teacher. That's really what our jobs are. We're teachers. And it doesn't matter whether you want that job or not. You're stuck with it simply by virtue of being a leader, because your people are watching you all the time, and they're observing you, and they're taking their cue from you about what we really stand for around here. You know, we could put up all the signs in the world. We could talk about it all day. But at the end of the day, what you and the other leaders in your company do tells them more than anything. You know, I say all the time that They're learning from you, from everything you do, and they're even learning from the things you don't do. You ever think about that? Brenda, how do you think people could learn from what you don't do?
Ooh, a lot just went through my mind. I tend to, because I have the overall business, I tend to want to understand the big picture all the time, because they'll do their little slices, and then I realize, oh wait, I hired them for the slice, so I need to stay focused, like I want them to be.
Yeah.
So I should not be. Does that make sense?
Yeah, or even in a simpler way, you say it's important to be on time and you're late. What do you think you just taught them? I guess it's not important. You say it's important to keep the facility clean, and you walk past a piece of trash as you go right by it and you don't pick it up. What do you think you just taught them? Pam or Tim sees somebody in the shop not wearing, a hard hat or whatever protective gear that they might have out there, and you don't address it with them. I guess safety is not that important for you. Everything you do and don't do is teaching them. You see somebody operating in a way that's inconsistent with what you claim your culture is, and you fail to address it with them, you're showing them it's not that important. Everything you do is teaching them. So when you think about that, you just start elevating your level of intentionality about what you're doing. In other words, you're about to do something, and I sometimes think it this way, it's almost like you've got a megaphone, and everything you do is amplified in its impact simply because of your role as a leader. Somebody else in your company could do the same thing, wouldn't have the same impact. You do it, it has magnified impact. So when you accept that, you just start being way more thoughtful about what you're doing. You're about to do or say something, and you realize, I'm casting a message to my team right now. Let me be really thoughtful about what I'm doing. One of my experiences, having worked with so many thousands of leaders, is that we often fail to appreciate the impact that we have on those who are around us. In other words, you come in one morning and you don't say good morning to somebody who reports to you. And half the time they're wondering, am I getting fired? Is she mad at me? Did I do something wrong? And meanwhile, you're just thinking about, why the Packers lost again. And it's just, you're not thinking about them, but to them, they think everybody's focused on them. And so when you just accept that, you just start being more aware of your impact on the people around you and being more purposeful about promoting the things that you want your culture to be about. All right, the eighth and last step in the overall framework, then we're going to do a deeper dive. I call it driving accountability. When I refer to creating accountability, I don't mean general accountability, but more specifically, accountability for the culture. In other words, how are we showing ourselves or people, the world, that we're actually serious about this? We're not messing around. And there are a lot of different ways we can do that. For example, I'll bet some of you do this. How many of you have elements of your culture built into whatever performance review system you have? Anybody? Maybe sort of, kind of. I mean, if I'm in your company, Pam and Tim, and I'm sitting with my manager, supervisor, and I'm going through a performance review, whatever that looks like in your organization, and nowhere in the conversation is there any discussion at all about our culture, what conclusion do you think I might come to?
Then it really doesn't matter.
Yeah, it's probably not that important. I mean, it's not the only thing there, but it probably ought to be there somewhere if it was important to us. Of course, it would be difficult to do that in a substantive way if I didn't have enough clarity about what the culture was supposed to be in the first place, which is why that's so important. We'll talk about that. Here's another example of accountability. This is something I do in my company and a lot of our clients. So my company's culture, you're going to learn about this shortly, is based upon a very specific set of behaviors that we practice, like honoring commitments. I gave you that example before. We do this annual survey. And what we do in the survey is we take each of the behaviors that define our culture and we write a description of what would you observe if we were doing this well. And so, for example, honor commitments would say our employees do what they say they're going to do when they say they're going to do it. That's what I mean by honoring commitments. So we write a description like that for each of the behaviors that define our culture. Then every year we survey 3 groups. We survey our customers, we survey our vendors and suppliers, and we survey our own employees. And we ask them on each of these specific behaviors. Do we almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never do that? Now we're being really transparent. I mean, this is a bunch of BS, or do we actually do the things that we talk about? Then we take the almost always, usually, sometimes, seldom, or never, and convert that to a 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 scale. And we can now put a number on how well we live to the stuff we talk about. If you're into continuous improvement like I am, you could look at what your score was this year, resurvey next year, and ask, have we improved the degree of consistency between what we claim our culture is and what actually is showing up every day? Now we're getting pretty serious. There's a lot of different things you can do, but let me ask you this, anybody, what do you think is the single most impactful thing that you can do to demonstrate seriousness or accountability for your culture? How do people know that we're not kidding about this?
I don't know, David, that's an interesting question. I mean, I think part of it is putting it into those reviews and just making sure that you can start those conversations and being very intentional of talking about it on a regular basis. Like, it's not even just the reviews, like we have our one-on-one check-ins. So we're talking weekly with them about it. But
yeah, I think all of those are important, though I think, Tammy, there's something even bigger than that.
Give it to me, David. I can't wait to find out what it is.
Brenda will tell you.
Come on, Brenda.
What came to mind, because I'm in the middle of it right now, is we actually are letting someone go because they don't share our values. And it's very often.
I knew Brenda was going to give it to you. Exactly. Get rid of somebody. You know, virtually every company I've ever worked with, honestly, has at least one person who desperately needs to be fired. They're a pain in the butt. They're opposite of everything we keep saying is important around here. We talk about them in management meetings over and over again, and they're still here. My anecdotal study of this is not research, just anecdotal, but see if this matches your experience. My experience is about 70 to 75% of these people historically tend to be salespeople. You ever notice that? About 10 or 15% are usually in finance, and about 10 or 15% usually have some kind of a technical skill. And what do they all share in common that makes us reluctant to get rid of these? Why don't we get rid of these people? Say it again, Brenda.
We need them badly, that when they leave, there's a hole quickly.
Yeah, it's usually our fear of our ability to replace them. You know, if it's the classic sales guy or woman, he's a pain in the butt. He's opposite of everything we say matters, but man, that guy brings in a ton of business. Or he's got some of our most important customer relationships. I mean, this culture stuff's nice. I'm not stupid. I'm not going to do that. You know, if it's the finance person, she's been with us for 24 years and our business is so complicated, I don't want to think about what it would look like to replace her. If it's the technical guy, that guy's got a skill set that those guys aren't just walking around the street. I lose that guy. I'm not going to replace that guy. And that's the excuse we use for not dealing with it. We allow ourselves to be held hostage by these people. And all the while, we're sending a loud, clear message to the whole company, aren't we? We're telling everybody, folks, I want you to understand something here. Our culture is really, really important. Unless you produce enough business, that's what we're telling them. I sometimes say it this way, this is kind of blunt, but the best way for me to really know your culture is to look at the behavior that you tolerate. I don't care about all the nice stuff you told me on the first day or the signs you put on the website or the walls. What you allow to keep going on, that's the real culture. I mean, you refer to that kind of as your friends, DJ, when you're talking about, you know, what gets sort of allowed or permitted in the group becomes the norm. How many of you have ever fired one of those people? Did you ever do that in your career? You ever fire one of those people? When you did, what did everybody else say?
Deep sigh of relief.
Yeah, usually that. Thank you. We were wondering when you were going to do this. Yeah.
Yeah, and it elevated the rest of the team.
Every time it elevates the rest of the team. And what did you say to yourself afterwards?
Why didn't I do it sooner?
Yep, always. I've never heard somebody say, dang, we fired that guy too soon. Never. It's always, I should have done it a long time ago. Always. And think about the message that you just sent to those who are sitting on the fence about culture. You just got rid of Susie. She was our #1 sales performer. They're not kidding. I better get my butt in gear. I mean, you'll never send a clearer message than that. And I want to be crystal clear about this. I'm a huge advocate for coaching and mentoring. I'm not suggesting at the earliest sign of trouble we're clearing people out. I'm talking about people we've been coaching and mentoring forever. And at some point, you don't get to be on the team anymore. It's the clearest we'll ever be that we're not messing around about this. So this is the framework we're going to use to think about how we could be a lot more purposeful, a lot more systematic in our approach to building and embedding the culture that we want. Now that we've got that big picture, we're going to do a 5-minute break. Just get up, move around, go to the bathroom, whatever you need to do. And when we come back, we're going to go deeper. And I want to go deep on the 2 things that I said would really make the biggest difference. So how are we going to define exactly what we want that culture to be with a lot more clarity than the typical stuff? And then how do we operationalize that so it's living in our people in a sustainable way? So that's what we're going to do next. So let's do a 5-minute break and be back ready to rock in 5 minutes. All right. Get up, move around, do whatever you need to do. I'll pause the recording too. Our recording. All right. So before we go deeper, let me just do a quick check-in with you. Questions on anything that I've said so far?
You might get into this, David, but I've been following you for a while, so we rolled it out, calling it behaviors. And I was surprised the reaction was, behaviors? You're going to tell us how to behave now? I was totally shocked by that. That what would be another word? Because we're slowly getting over that now that they see what they are and all that. But do you have any advice on that?
It's one of the reasons. There are a number of different words people use, and for the benefit of others, we're going to talk about behaviors versus values in a moment, and you'll see why behaviors are so important. In teaching it, like to a group like this or to companies, I talk about behaviors. The language that I use for behaviors is we call them fundamentals. So we don't use the word in talking with an employee. These are our fundamentals. And because you've got fundamentals in music, sports, dance, almost everything, that there are fundamentals to how we operate around here. And I do, in talking with employees, for the very reason that you just identified, Brenda, I don't typically use the word behaviors with them because it can for them have a little bit of a pejorative or a derogatory, like, yes, I'm a child and you're going to tell me how to behave. And so fundamentals I use is the word that most people use. A few other words that companies use. I've seen companies use the word basics. I've seen companies use the word tenets, principles. But I like fundamentals because, again, we're used to thinking of, again, you think about a professional sporting team, and even as professionals, as advanced as they are, they spend a tremendous amount of time working on their fundamentals because these are the things we do that help us to be successful. In the same way, these are the things that help us to be successful in our companies. So that's why I use that language.
In service businesses that we work with, where really culture is about embodiment, we tend to talk in terms of ways of being. Yep. Which seems to be a little less alienating than behaviors. Behaviors seems like parent to child.
Exactly. And similar to what you're saying, DJ, we often describe the fundamentals as a company's way. This is the XYZ company way. This is the way we do things around here. And specifically, the way we do things is we practice these particular fundamentals. But that way language, I think I like that as well. So this will make more sense for everybody as I go deeper on. So what do we mean by a behavior, and why is that language, or why is the concept of it, forget the language, why is the concept so important? So one of the real foundations of what I teach people, and that is different, what I teach here is different from most others, is that I do make a big deal about the difference between what I call values and what I call behaviors. Because I think the difference is actually really significant, and it's not just a question of semantics. So let me, and forget for a moment what we call them to the staff, conceptually, values and behaviors. And the difference, I think, is really important. So the difference to me is that typically a value is usually an abstract concept. So examples of values are things like integrity, quality, respect, innovation, teamwork, service, passion, commitment, leadership. These are ideas, concepts in our mind. A behavior, in contrast, is an action. It's something I could literally see people doing. So some of the behaviors that we teach in our company, which again, we call fundamentals, but they're behaviors, are things like, as I showed behind me, honor commitments. That's something you actually do. Practice blameless problem solving. Be a fanatic about response time. Get clear on expectations. Follow up on everything. Listen generously. Look ahead and anticipate. These are actions that people do. So a value is typically an abstract idea where a behavior is an action. In parts of speech, I sometimes think of it almost like a value is a noun and a behavior is a verb. It's a thing versus an action, okay? Now, why does that distinction matter? Who cares? Well, here's why this is relevant and not just a question of semantics. The problem in my experience with most companies, not all, but most companies' traditional looking set of core values is that they tend to be so abstract that they mean too many different things to different people, and they therefore become very difficult to operationalize in any meaningful kind of way. So let me give you a really simple example. One of the core values that I see in many organizations is they'll have the value for respect. We should all respect each other. And it sounds like a perfectly good thing. Who would argue with that? But what does that word mean? It means a lot of different things to different people. I mean, if you grew up in an inner city gang, your definition of what it looks like to respect somebody or maybe to diss them could be completely different than what it means in your family. Or I think about regional differences. When I'm in the deep South, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, those kind of states, if you grew up in the deep South, you would have been raised as a child and taught when you speak to an adult, you call them sir or ma'am. It's disrespectful not to do that. Do that in the Northeast where I live, that's just freaking weird. It has nothing to do with respect at all, just different norms. I have a college friend of mine. He's actually in Ohio. He's a school superintendent of a large public school district outside of Columbus, Ohio. Do you know the Westerville School District, if you guys know where that is? He's a longtime superintendent there, John Kellogg. And John was telling me that the teachers in his school district were angry with him because they felt disrespected because they didn't get a large enough pay increase. He looks at that and says, that's a budget issue. There's nothing to do with respect. To them, oh, it's most decidedly a respect issue. We all have different ideas of what that word means. So to simply say, well, one of our core values is respect, okay, sounds good. I'm just not sure it's all that helpful for people. Behaviors, because they're so much more action-oriented, tend to be a lot easier to teach and coach and guide and give people feedback about. Now, I'll share with you a story of where I saw this done in a way that I thought was pretty interesting. And then I want to show you like a slightly different way to think about this. So I was, a few years ago, I was actually in Cleveland, so not far from you. And I was in the Cleveland airport. And this goes back maybe 4 or 5 years ago. I was in the Cleveland airport and I was, lo and behold, on the wall in front of me, there was a big sign and it had the Cleveland airport's vision, mission, and values, which this was before, I think, before they did the convention was there and they changed a lot of things, but they had their vision, mission, and values on the wall. And I thought this was pretty interesting. And so I took a picture of it because I hadn't seen that in an airport before. I mean, I could tell you for sure we don't have it in Philadelphia. And if we did, you wouldn't want to read what we'd probably have up on the wall. But anyway, being in the business these days, I took a picture of it. And what caught my attention, besides the fact that this was unusual to see in an airport, is the way that they had put this together. And this is what they did, which I thought was interesting. they had their vision and their mission, and there were like 5 or 6 values of the Cleveland Airport. But underneath each of their core values, there was a series of bullet pointed statements. And this is what it looked like. It said, we value quality. Underneath it, it said, we demonstrate this by doing the following things. Bullet point, bullet point, bullet point, bullet point. We value integrity. We demonstrate that by doing the following things. Bullet point. Those bullet points are really behaviors, aren't they? You might think of a behavior as the action form of a value. It's how I live to the value is by actually doing something. I thought that was an interesting approach. Well, having worked with literally hundreds and hundreds of companies, helping them to more clearly define exactly what they want their culture to be, what I've discovered is there are a lot of different ways you can do this. I want to be crystal clear on this point. There is not one right way and everybody else is wrong. There's lots of ways you could approach this. And yet, having said that, there's at least a couple of methods that I've just found to be pretty successful in my career. The first method I call the Cleveland Airport method. That is, we could define a set of core values, and for each of the core values, we could sort of unpack them into describing what are the behaviors that help us to live to that core value. Very logical approach. But there's another approach, which I did in my own first company many years ago, not knowing any of this, about 20 years ago. And it's actually what almost all of our clients did. And this is going to sound sacrilegious to some of you, so I'll just apologize up front. We could skip the whole core values discussion and go right to the behaviors, because at the end of the day, isn't that what you want people to do? You want them to do something. So what do I need all that other stuff for? Now, admittedly, that sounds a little weird because the whole world, practically except for me, says, well, wait a second, time out. You can't be running your company without defining your core values. That's really important. And I say, I don't know about that. What I know is you need to have the behaviors because that's what you want to see people do. Now, what's interesting is years ago, I used to say to people, look, either approach is fine. What difference does it make? If you feel better, you're more comfortable having a set of core values and organizing your behaviors around it, cool, that's fine. And if you'd rather skip the extra steps and just kind of get right to the heart of it more directly, hey, that's cool too, because either way, you're still getting to the behaviors. So what difference does it make, right? I used to say that, but I don't say that anymore. Because what I discovered, it was interesting when I figured this out. What I discovered is that those two different methods will actually yield two different lists of behaviors. So why do you think that would be? Why would the Cleveland Airport method give me a different list of behaviors than the method? Think, DJ?
Thinking out loud. The first thought that I had was that the Cleveland Airport method might yield a culture that is more performative. So essentially like checking boxes. People are kind of living that way, but they're just like, and I guess the deeper thought is not necessarily performative, but essentially like a culture of I'll do whatever the minimum is required of me.
Mm-hmm.
Rather than sort of embodiment, because they're outlined. Well, you said it's these 6 things, I did those 6 things, but there's not any sort of like deeper thought into what the implications of those 6 things might be to actually take the culture deeper.
It's possible. Yeah, that might be true. So what do you think about that, Tammy? Why do you think the list of behaviors might be different if I started with my core values versus I didn't start with my core values?
I don't know. However, when I think of I'm just sitting in it a lot because we just introduced new core values a month before I came to the organization. So now I'm kind of in my role not backpedaling, but figuring out how this comes to life, right? So as we go through that, so the method, so we subscribe to number 1, the Cleveland Airport method. We're there. And it's funny because, David, we had the that we do it by. So the new or the CEO that came in switched it around a little bit. So it's been interesting. So back to your core question though, I think when you see those words, it really is, everybody has, again, a different connotation of it and what that is, and that preconceived maybe notion of what it is versus the behaviors by which we do are more prescriptive. So but I don't know.
Yeah, so I'm going to suggest something. This is very subtle, but it's actually really important. What's actually happening in the Cleveland Airport method is we're actually introducing a limiter or a constraint to our thinking. Because notice the only behaviors you would think of are the ones that tie to those core values. So, but there might be other behaviors that are really important in our company that never even come up because you limited yourself right from the beginning. So let me just sort of show you an illustration of this. So in the Cleveland Airport method, we'd ask ourselves, what are my core values? And just to make the example simple, let's just say there were 4 of them. And I'm going to call them integrity, quality, excellence, and service. I mean, perfectly good values. Then we would ask ourselves, all right, well, what do we mean by integrity? And what do we mean by quality? And so on. And let's just say that we came up with 4 behaviors for each one. So acting with integrity looks like doing these behaviors, and producing quality work looks like these, and so on. So this is what the Cleveland Airport method would be, or what, Tammy, it sounds like your organization has been doing. And that's better than not having those behaviors. But here's the issue. It turns out that there are, again, behaviors that could be really important in the company that don't necessarily tie to integrity, quality, excellence, or service. And we would never even think about them. As we're brainstorming, they wouldn't even come up in the conversation, because right from the beginning, we put this paradigm, this structure in place that said the only things we're allowed to talk about here are integrity, quality, excellence, and service. Do you follow what I mean by that? Now, to be clear, I'm not suggesting that these 2 approaches are diametrically opposed. There might be 85% overlap, but there might be 15% items that are really important that would never even come up if you started with those values. Now, let me offer to you a couple of thoughts here that, as I've taught this to many, many people, often come up as questions. And so I'll just sort of address them up front. The first question I get often when I teach this to people is they'll say, you know what, that makes some sense. I hadn't quite thought about it that way before, but couldn't we perhaps, maybe we could reverse engineer it. We could start with our behaviors and just, no limits, just think about all the behaviors that drive success in our company, and then try to distill them down to see, well, what are the values that emerge out of that? And my point of view is, I guess we could do that, but why? If my goal was to get to the behaviors and I'm already there, I'm not sure what the utility is in going backwards. And what ends up happening from a purely pragmatic standpoint when we try to do that is we end up arguing about it. Well, is it really excellence or is that really quality? Well, I don't know which box to put it in. Or we end up with 6 things in one box and 2 in another. Does that mean this one's 3 times as important as that one? Or then this almost always happens when we do that exercise is at the end of the exercise, inevitably somebody raises their hand and says, time out. I got a question. Could we have a value called miscellaneous? Because I don't know where to put these 3 behaviors. And it just ends up being this frustrating exercise that's largely unnecessary. But there's another question that comes up often when I teach this, to be honest. And that is that I'll teach this to people and they say, that makes some sense. But where were you 5 years ago? Because for the last 5 years, we've been talking about our core values. They're on our walls, they're on our website, they're in our performance reviews. I can't possibly tell people, just heard that Friedman guy, we're going to scrap all that stuff. So what are we going to do now? So here's the easiest answer, done this many, many, many times. If you, or in DJ's cases, your clients already have a set of core values that you've been promoting, that they're on the website, you talk about them a lot. And I want to be crystal clear here. I'm not suggesting in any way that they're stupid, just that they may not have quite the degree of clarity that would help us be as effective as possible. Here's what I suggest you do. I suggest you take those core values and just for a moment, park them on the side. Allow yourselves the intellectual freedom to, without any limits at all, think about the behaviors that are important around this company. And then when we message them into the organization, the way we message them into the organization is we say, you know those 5 core values that are on our website and we've been talking about for years? Well, those values are really important in our company. But what do those values mean on a day-to-day basis? Well, this set of fundamentals is how we live to those values. Now, very importantly, this is subtle but important, we don't need to do a mapping of them. We don't need to say these 3 behaviors equal quality and these 4 equal service. We're just going to say the way we live to the set of values is by practicing the set of behaviors. And that allows us to introduce this into the organization as a deepening of our historical work, as an extension of that historical work, instead of it feeling like we abandoned everything we always used to talk about. Do you understand that distinction that I'm drawing? So what I'm suggesting is, if you already have a set of core values that you are heavily invested in, then fine, we put them on the side, figure out our behaviors, and we just say the way we live to those values is by doing these fundamentals. If you don't have that set of core values, or maybe they were written 12 years ago and nobody even knows what they are, I just wouldn't worry about it. In my company, we do not talk about any set of core values at all. We live those fundamentals every single day. They're our language, they're the way our people think, I mean, they're just everything for us. We talk about it all the time. I just don't have anything else I need to be defining. Understand that distinction? So again, if you already have your core values and we need them and we're invested in them, all right, we live to them by practicing this. If you don't have that, we just go right to the behaviors. So I'm going to suggest that we define our culture not necessarily in terms of those big, broad, lofty core values, but rather in terms of the behaviors that you say, if we could get our people to do these things consistently, oh my God, we'd be really kicking some butt. Questions about that so far?
And the argument for that is simply that starting from values creates a layer of abstraction that is counterproductive.
Well, I'd say not so much layer of abstraction, DJ. I'd say a layer of constraint.
Okay. Oh, yeah. Okay. Got it. Yeah.
It limits what we think of. So ultimately, we want to get to behaviors. No matter how we get there, we want to get to behaviors because that's what we can operationalize more effectively.
It might overtly narrow your thinking about. Yeah.
Exactly. And that's why in the thinking of behaviors, I'd rather just start from scratch. What's important around here? Okay. Now, as we do that, as we work on figuring out what our behaviors are, there is a mistake that I see many companies make that I want to identify so that we could try to avoid this. The biggest mistake that I see companies make in trying to do this kind of work is that too often we make this too collaborative a process. So why do you think I'd call that a mistake? I mean, shouldn't we get everybody involved? What do you think, Brenda?
We tried that and it was a disaster because it just went all over the place and everyone has their own interpretation. So yeah, we unfortunately did that, and then we were back to our founder rolled them out. So don't do it that way. Right?
So that's one reason we don't want to do that is, yeah, it could just get unwieldy and crazy and hard for everybody to agree. Why else? Tell me, what do you think? Why should we not make this too collaborative?
I mean, you're coming from the collaboration queen. So
Yes.
the reality in when I think of this exercise fundamentally for the organization, it really is our driving force, right? So I feel like that has always come from like the president, CEO, or the maybe 1 or 2, people, but not everybody. Because again, not everybody has that same perhaps vision of what it is, but typically your CEO will set that vision along with maybe 1 or 2 stakeholders.
Yeah, I agree with you there that ultimately this is a leadership function. If I'm the CEO, it's my job. It's my responsibility to set the vision of the company. That's what I can't abdicate that. It's my responsibility to say, this is where we're going as a company and to make sure that's happening. Now, just to add a level of nuance to what I just said, I'm a big advocate for the inclusion of a senior leadership team, but I'm going to be very specific in my language for this. So notice how I say this. I'm a big advocate for the inclusion of the senior leadership team, in this case for you guys, for your contribution to your CEO's thinking. Notice how I said that, for your contribution to the CEO's thinking. In other words, if I'm the CEO and you guys are my leadership team, I'm going to include you not to make you feel good. I'm going to include you because you're smart, because you got good ideas and your ideas could influence mine. But at the end of the day, this is not a majority vote. It's not a consensus. It's not, let's make sure everybody got some of what they wanted. It's what I want my company to be about, but I'm influenced by the smart people that are on my team. Do you understand that distinction? And we're definitely not going out to the whole company asking everybody, so what do you think the values are around here? I don't really care what they think they are. And I don't mean that in a derogatory way. That sounds more negative than I intended. It's just that I say this is a design function. We are designing the amazing company we're trying to build. We're not designing it around all the employees we happen to have in late October of 2023 and what they like. Some of them might not even be here in the future. Why would I be designing around them? Design around what I want my company to be about, not what everybody else wants it to be about. Now, there's a very good reason, just to add, again, a little more nuance to this. There's a very good reason that companies typically over-collaborate about this. There's just a fault in the logic, at least from my perspective. So why do we typically over-collaborate about this? This collaboration queen.
Because one of it is the theory would be that you would get buy-in from the beginning to be able to come up. So if you design it together, you'll be bought in from the beginning.
Yeah, and that's typically the reason, Tammy, is to get greater buy-in. And buy-in does matter. Buy-in is important. The mistake in the logic, in my experience, is thinking that the only or best way to accomplish that buy-in is for everybody to be co-authors of it. We get unbelievable buy-in every single time without fail in how it gets rolled out to all the workforce in highly interactive, engaged sessions that every single employee participates in, and they weren't the author of it. So buy-in does matter. There's just other ways to accomplish that. At the end of the day, this is a leadership function. What does the CEO want the company to be about? Not what does everybody else want? And Tammy, just to tap in just one step further in you as the collaboration queen, self-described collaboration queen. This is not a question of collaboration being a good or a bad thing. It depends on what the topic is. So
Absolutely.
there are different ways to make different decisions, and some should be total collaboration and participation. Some should be I'm making the decision. Depends on what the topic is. And the key is just to let everybody know, well, what game are we playing right now, so that everybody knows how to participate in that particular decision. So it's not that I'm for or against collaboration. It's just on this specific
totally support,
topic.
David.
Yeah,
Totally support. Collaboration is key in the organization of building high performing teams. The reality is there's decisions that have to be made at times that come from, I was a CEO in my former life as well. And sometimes buck stops there, right? So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And again, you just got to let the team know what we're doing right now so they know how to participate appropriately.
David, would you agree that culture, effective culture ends up looking less like consensus and more like alignment, right?
Yes.
Differentiation.
Totally would agree with that, DJ, that yes. And it's important that you raise that, because the fact that it's coming from me doesn't mean it's not important to align people. It's very important. If I'm a good leader, yes, I have a vision of where I'm taking this company, and it's my responsibility to get people aligned and excited and motivated behind that. Consensus would imply I'm asking everybody what they want and making sure I'm satisfied. I'm not doing that. I'm aligning them, to use it. It's a good distinction you're drawing there. Absolutely. So when we describe behaviors, or I use the nomenclature fundamentals, we want to give each one a title and a description that brings more clarity to what we mean by that. So it's not just like a one-word thing. So to give you an example of just one of my fundamentals is called practice blameless problem solving. And what you see behind me is a description of what does it mean to practice blameless problem solving. So every fundamental in our company has a title and a brief description of what that looks like. Or to show you another one, well, here's another version of it. This is one of my clients on their website. This is what it means to practice blameless problem solving. And so there's a title and a description. So that brings, notice the clarity that that brings versus the typical quality, excellence, service, respect. You know, when you can describe this is what we really want people doing, and you've got a list of these behaviors, now we really have something that we can sink our teeth into and give people a lot more clarity about their expectations. So that's what a fundamental looks like. There's a title that's written in action form and a description that explains what you want people to do. So if we can describe our fundamentals, our culture in terms of a set of fundamentals with titles and descriptions, now we're bringing so much more clarity to the culture that we want. And it's much easier to teach and coach and guide. It is very difficult to coach somebody about their core values, but I could coach them all day long about what I see them doing or not doing. And this gives them the clarity of really what we're looking for. So the first thing we've got to do then is we've got to get way more clarity about what we want our culture to be by describing an appropriate set of behaviors, or I call them fundamentals, that tell people this is what it looks like to be successful in our company. Now, once we have that set of fundamentals, that second step in the overall framework that I was describing, so step 2, is this whole idea of creating rituals. So this is how we operationalize what we just wrote, because it's great to have a set of fundamentals or behaviors, but if all we've done is gotten more clarity, but we still can't get our people to adopt this and to internalize and actually live these behaviors, then we really haven't accomplished anything other than we have a nice poster or card. We got to get this internalized in our people. And we do this through this concept that I call creating rituals. So a ritual is a behavior that we do over and over and over again until it just becomes second nature. It's just what we do around here. And a simple example of a ritual that you're all familiar with is, think about every time you go to a professional sporting event, or even a collegiate one for that matter. You were at the Packers game, you said this weekend, Tammy. What do they do right before the first kickoff of every football game?
Sing the national anthem.
Yeah. You don't go to a game and say, I wonder if they do the national anthem tonight. It's not like if they're not running behind schedule, they see if they can squeeze it in, or they'll assign it to somebody and say, Tim, it's your job to remember tonight. It's just what we do. It's just a routine. And the reason that's so important, not the anthem, but this idea that it's such a routine, is that it's our nature as humans. It's just how we're wired, that most humans stink at sticking with things. We're just not very good at it. I mean, I guarantee you, if I came to visit you in your area in early January, I'll bet every gym in your area would be mobbed, wouldn't it? Because this is the year we're getting healthy until February. Then we're back to our normal levels of activity. And I joked about things that we roll out in our companies with all the best of intentions, that this is really going to last. And then we get busy and it doesn't last because we get distracted easily. It's hard to stick with things. Well, when something becomes a ritual, it's not difficult to stick with. There's an example that I give in many of my workshops. It's kind of a silly example, but I use it because it makes the point clear. And I'll have an audience and I'll ask them, so go back to last week and Monday morning, and I want you to think about your state of mind when you woke up Monday morning. And I'll ask them, so how many of you said this to yourself? It's a brand new week. This week, I'm going to be really focused, determined, disciplined. And I'm going to see if I can go every single day this week. And I mean, literally every day, not even missing one, brushing my teeth every morning. And they all laugh because that's so silly. And I'll ask them, so, all right, how many of you have gotten it in every day this week? And of course, they all raise their hand. And I'll ask them, well, how did you pull that off? And people begin to say, well, I guess I have a ritual about it. I wake up in the morning, I go through a series of activities. I don't sit there and struggle. I'm not sitting there saying, God, I don't feel like doing it today. I made it last night. I'm just not in the mood, but I probably should. This isn't a struggle. It's just what we do. Well, that's the power of a ritual. Once something becomes baked in as a ritual, it's not hard to do. It's just what we do. So here's how we can use that simple concept. If we can create rituals that were as automatic as brushing our teeth or doing the national anthem, or when I was a kid in school, we used to say the Pledge of Allegiance every morning, or some people say a prayer before a meal. If we could create rituals that were that automatic around how we teach and practice those behaviors, those fundamentals, now we've got something that could be sustainable for years and years and years into the future, because its continuity, its sustainability would no longer be dependent upon our discipline and motivation. You see, I always tell people, you can't overpower this with discipline and motivation. You can't say to yourself, you know, I know we're not usually good at sticking with stuff, but that stuff Friedman told us is really important, and this time we're gonna make it stick. You're not. You know, you're gonna get busy, life's gonna get in the way, and you're gonna forget about it, unless you build rituals around it and you let the rituals do the work instead of you. And I want to show you how to do that. Now, quick version of the story of how I learned about all of this. This story goes back 20 years ago. My first company, my benefits company, was always known for amazing customer service. We were just rock stars at that. And I was thinking about it, and I wanted to plan some kind of an activity where I could take my whole staff off site and give us a chance to think bigger about amazing service. And so what I did is I chartered a couple of buses. I loaded everybody in my company up on buses, and we went over to the Ritz-Carlton in Philadelphia, where we were going to have lunch and then spend the afternoon in a meeting room doing some brainstorming about amazing service. And, you know, I figured Ritz-Carlton, they're like, you think gold level service, you're thinking Ritz-Carlton. And I called them and I explained to them why I was coming that day. And I asked them, do you think you can have someone come during lunch, and while we're eating lunch, you could share with us some of the systems and processes that you must have behind the scenes that enable you to deliver the service that you do with the consistency that you do? Because I was guessing, though I didn't know back then, it couldn't have been that they were lucky. They just seemed to hire nice people and everything worked out okay. No way, there's got to be more to it than that. So anyway, they had a woman from their HR department come, and she spent probably a half hour with us, and she shared with us a lot of different things, but two things in particular that I wouldn't be exaggerating if I told you that the two things I learned that day literally changed the course of the rest of my career. They led to everything that I teach these days. The first thing I learned about is something that's known as the Ritz-Carlton basics. So Ritz-Carlton has 20 behaviors that they teach. And they have them on a little laminated card, and they're numbered 1 through 20, and these are called their basics. And these are simple things like, here's my Ritz-Carlton picture. These are simple things that if you went to a Ritz-Carlton and you asked, where's the women's room, Brenda, they'd never say, you go down the hall, you turn right, it's back by the elevator. They'd say, let me show you. And they would walk you back there. They have a basic that's called notice and record guest preferences. If Tim likes his coffee black, somebody's paying attention to that. They write that down, they put it in their computer. Next time Tim's at a Ritz-Carlton, everybody there knows you got to give him his coffee black. So they pay attention to this stuff. So there's 20 different behaviors that are called their basics, numbered 1 through 20 on this card. I thought that was interesting, but the much more interesting thing is how they use this. The way they use it is they have a ritual. They don't use that word, it's my word. Their ritual is called the daily lineup. And here's what happens. Every single day, in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world, in every department and in every shift, the team members get together at the beginning of the shift. And they gather around, they have this 10 or 12 minute meeting. It's called the daily lineup. And the first thing they do in their daily lineup each day is they talk about the basic of the day. So remember I said there's 20 of these. If I happen to be in Ritz-Carlton right now, and we happen to be on day number 1, all day long in every department, every shift, people are getting together and they're kicking off their shift talking about basic number 1. What does it mean? How do we practice it? Did it just come up with a guest yesterday? 3-4 minutes. The rest of the brief meeting is whatever's relevant in that particular department. Tomorrow, everybody's getting together and they're all talking about basic number 2, and the next day, number 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and so on for 20 days. And what do you think they do at the end of 20 days?
Start over.
Exactly. And they do it over and over and over and over again every day of their entire career. So on a given property, this could happen 40 or more times a day, given all the different departments and shifts. And think about the diversity of a Ritz-Carlton. They have landscapers, dishwashers, housekeepers, banquet salespeople, corporate execs, so many people at so many different levels, and they drive this amazingly consistent culture through that diverse workforce, because every single day, every one of them is in a daily lineup, and they're all talking about the same basic. And get this, if today's day number 7, it's day number 7 in every Ritz-Carlton property in the world today. They have roughly 40,000 employees on 5 continents, 35 or 40 countries, hundreds of properties. And today, on October the 30th, every one of their 40,000 employees is in a daily lineup, and they're all talking about the same basic. That's what consistency looks like. So I heard that 20 years ago, and it just struck a chord in me. And I thought, that's really interesting. I wonder why that works so well. And more importantly, how could I apply those concepts in my company? I was an insurance agency, a benefits consulting company. I'm not a hotel, but there's something powerful going on here. So I went home literally that weekend, and I began to think, if I had behaviors or basics, what would my basics be? Some of them I'd written years before, others I had ranted about, but had never codified in any particular way. And over the course of a weekend, I put together a list of 30 behaviors that, this is my first company. It was called RSI, was my first company. And I put together this list of behaviors, and I decided, like you noted, Brenda, that the word behavior would sound a little condescending perhaps. And so I decided that I would call these our fundamentals. And so that's what I call behaviors or fundamentals. And so there are now, I don't know, there's probably 1,000 companies around the country who practice fundamentals. It's just the name I made up for a behavior. So now I had my fundamentals, that's great. But what about that daily lineup thing? I mean, that's where the real power is here. Well, the first decision I made is, I'm not a hotel. I don't have departments and shifts like that. I'm an office environment. And it's hard for me to picture us doing a daily lineup like that. So then I thought, well, what if I take one of these every month and we focus on? But, you know, if we were to talk about it today and it was 30 days before we did anything else, is that really going to do anything? Probably not. So then I thought, well, what if I take one of these every week, which is what I ultimately did and do, is I rolled it out to my whole company in very interactive, engaged sessions. And then we began to focus on one fundamental each week through a series of rituals. And obviously we call it the fundamental of the week. So just to give you an example of what I mean by that, the beginning of every week, one of the rituals that we do that are in my company and every one of our clients is I said, here's what we're going to do. Every time we have a meeting in our company, whether it's a project team meeting, a department meeting, a leadership meeting, a Zoom meeting. My current company is completely remote, so every one of our meetings is a Zoom meeting. The first agenda item of every one of our meetings is our fundamental of the week. So my fundamental in my company this week is called Celebrate Success. It's about providing what we call meaningful acknowledgement and appreciation throughout the company. It's actually, I have a wristband that I change this every week. It's actually on my wrist. Says Celebrate Success. So every Sunday I change this. And so every meeting, everywhere in my company this week, first thing we do is we spend a few minutes talking about celebrating success. What does that mean? What makes it hard to do sometimes? Are there times where you do it and it's not very effective? Or are there different ways to do it that are more effective? And we spend 3 to 5 minutes. We don't want to take over the meeting, just a few minutes, and then we move on. But every meeting, everywhere in my company this week, we're talking about celebrating success. Next week, every one of our meetings starts with next week's fundamental, and the following week, the following fundamental, and so on. So think about your company and think about all the different meetings that are probably going to take place in your company this week of all different types with all different groups of employees. And imagine if in every single one of those meetings, every single one of your employees was talking about the same principle. That's a lot of power to that. It's an incredibly effective ritual because it just bakes it into the things that we're doing. So this is what I mean by rituals. So what we do is we create a number of different rituals like that give everybody in the company lots and lots of opportunities to think about, work on, talk about, practice, focus on this week's fundamental. And if we do that this week for this week's fundamental, and next week for number 2, and the next week for number 3, and so on, and we keep cycling through them over and over and over and over again, sooner or later, these behaviors, these fundamentals start to become internalized in our people. And that's the concept behind using rituals. When you're thinking about rituals and thinking about rituals that might be relevant for your company, one of the principles that you always want to think about is easier is always better. That anything that's going to be a lot of work and a lot of effort is not likely to last. It'll be great for 6 weeks and then we'll say, oh, that's too much work, and we'll stop doing it. So we always want to look for easy ways to do things that we can fold into what we're already doing. So for example, in my company, and all of our clients do this too, in our company, I did not say, let's start a new meeting where we could all talk about our fundamental. Because what would they have probably said if I did? Not another meeting with everything else on my plate. Who's got time for that? I didn't do that. I said, this is easy. Let's just take a couple of minutes of the meeting. You're already in. That takes no extra time. You're already there. How easy is that? You all have rituals. You may not use that language, but there's likely a cadence to your business. Every Tuesday is our sales meeting. Every Thursday is our production review. Every Friday we do this. Tim and Pam, do you guys in the factory or the plant, do you guys do any kind of safety rituals? You're the operations guy, Tim. Do you guys do safety rituals?
But we have training, stuff like that. Not real.
But you don't do, like, a lot of companies I've worked with in manufacturing, especially construction, do, like, they call them daily toolbox talks or tailgate talks. You familiar with that? Yeah,
we do have on a weekly basis where they do like a 15 to 10 minute team meeting to go over what happened last week.
Yeah. So you could take something like that and just fold a fundamental of the week discussion right into that, because you already have that structured. Every time we create something new and extra, it's an impediment to success. I mean, if we have nothing, we'll create it. But better to ask yourself first, what are we already doing in a ritualistic kind of way? And is there a way that I could fold a conversation of the fundamental of the week right into what we're already doing? So always look there first.
Great example.
And by the way, when I think about the safety one, just as another example, because it's so common in construction and manufacturing fields, if I was comparing two companies and their safety record, one of them every single day is talking about safety, 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 and a different one puts a sign on the wall that says, keep safety a priority, which one's more likely to have a better safety record? Obviously, the one that talks about it all the time. Well, the same is true of our culture. We could put a sign on our website with our vision, mission, and values and think, got the culture thing done. Or we could talk about it every single day. If we're talking about it every single day, we're more likely to be living it. It's pretty simple. I want to show you one last illustration. That this is kind of a distilling of everything we've talked about this afternoon into one simple kind of concept. And then I'll wrap this up and answer further questions. So if you want to learn anything so well that you've mastered it or you've internalized it, whether we're talking about you want to be a concert pianist, or you want to learn to speak another language fluently, or to be a master cabinet maker, anything that you want to master, what do you have to do to master something?
Practice.
Practice, right? Tremendous amounts of focused practice and repetition. I mean, I could give you the best piano instructor the world's ever seen, and that's not going to make you a concert pianist unless you spend thousands and thousands of hours working at it. Everybody agree with that? Anybody know a shortcut for how you could be a concert pianist without having to practice? All right, if we all understand then that the only way we're going to master something is through lots and lots and lots of practice and repetition, here's the big question for you. How many people do you know who love to do practice and repetition? Not many. There are some, but not many. Well, that's kind of a problem. If we all understand that the only way we're going to master something is with lots and lots and lots of practice and repetition, except most people hate that, that's kind of a problem. So what's the key to being able to do practice and repetition? Say that again.
I mean, intentionally integrating it into your daily activities.
Yeah. And what do we call that, Tammy?
Rituals.
Exactly. Yes.
I listened, David.
Yes.
I mean, I wasn't here. So
Yes, you do. Yes, that's the whole concept I want you to do. Once something becomes a ritual, brushing our teeth, the national anthem, the safety rituals, the fundamental of the week, the basic of the day, the Pledge of Allegiance, the prayer before a meal. Once it becomes a ritual, it's not hard to do. It's just what we do. I use that word almost interchangeably with the word habit. There's a couple of big bestsellers some of you may have read, The Power of Habit. There's another book, Atomic Habits. It's the exact same concept. Once something becomes baked in as a ritual or a habit, it's not hard to do. It's just what we do. So the ritual is the foundation or the platform that enables that repetition to keep on happening. And the repetition is what's necessary to internalize or master something. So let's apply that thought very, very directly to your company's culture, okay? If driving a culture through your company ultimately is nothing fancier or more complicated than getting your people to live and internalize the behaviors that we talked about, because that's really all culture is. It's just getting people to do that stuff that you know would lead to success. Well, they're not going to internalize those behaviors simply because you held a big company meeting one day and you announced to them all. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do that, but that's not going to be enough. They're not going to internalize those behaviors because you put it in their performance reviews. Well, I still think you ought to. They're not going to internalize those behaviors because you put them on posters or you put them on your walls or you printed a card or you put them on your website. Though I think you ought to. The only way they're going to internalize it, we've already agreed, is when you teach it to them over and 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 over again. And the only way we're going to keep doing it with that much consistency without getting bored and quitting is when we build rituals around it. That's why rituals are so foundational to success. Does that make sense? To me, that's so simple. All right, let me just sort of organize everything that we've talked about in sort of in a nice little wrap-up bow. So we started this afternoon, I was talking about those two flight attendants that I mentioned, that Allison and Michael, and I asked you, if I were to randomly pick any of your people and just observe them, how confident are you that anybody that I would observe would be an Allison versus a Michael, and whether the chances that I got an Allison or a Michael in your company were mostly just luck, or is that the way your company does business? I'll tell you, at Ritz-Carlton, there's no luck involved in this at all. This is how they operate. In our company, that there's no luck. It's just how we do things. We talked about the women's lacrosse team in my own hometown and more broadly, public high school sports dynasties, because they overcome these two, I think, interesting challenges. One is, for the most part, they don't get to pick their people. And two, they turn over the roster every year. And yet somehow they keep building championship teams because they build championship cultures. We talked about that bell curve where you got the rock stars on one end, the lousy ones on the other, but 80% of our people are just going to go with the flow. They're just going to conform to the environment in which they find themselves. You put most of those people in a high-performing environment, and most of them are going to raise their performance. And you take the exact same people and you put them in a low-performing environment, and most of them are going to sink to the level of the people around them because the environment has that much influence over everything that happens. We talked about where culture comes from in a group of friends, because what I wanted you to see in that illustration is, as I said it, if you're not purposely creating your culture, it's getting created for you. It's not that it's not happening, it's happening. And it's mostly getting created by those people who just happen to have the strongest, most influential personalities, for better or worse. And obviously, the reason I wanted you to see that is if we understand the impact that our culture has on every aspect of the performance of our company, that's not something we want to leave to chance. That's something as leaders, we got to take control over that and make our culture be what we want it to be. There's a quote that is my favorite quote on the topic of culture. And the quote says, good companies have good cultures by chance. But world-class companies have world-class cultures by design. And what I mean by that quote, when I say that good companies have good cultures by chance, what I'm saying is if you and the others in your company are good leaders, you're going to naturally do most of the right stuff. I mean, you're good people. You're going to hire good people. You're going to treat them well, not because you read a book that said you should. Like, what else are you going to do? And if you do that, you're going to be fine. You'll have a good culture. You're not going to fail. I'm always very clear about the fact that what I teach people is not the difference between succeeding and failing. I mean, how could I claim it is? A whole lot of people have been successful without doing what I teach. So it can't be the difference. This isn't the difference between succeeding and failing. This is the difference between being successful and being extraordinary, because that's a whole different game. That while good companies have good cultures by chance, the best companies understand just how important their culture is to success, and they just don't leave any of it to chance. It's just too important. Instead, they're incredibly intentional, purposeful, and systematic about every single aspect of how they build their culture. And what I'm suggesting is if you want to take that on, this is one framework that you could use to think about how you could be a lot more systematic. And while all of the 8 steps that we talked about are important, the reason I do that illustration the way that I do with that circle is I sometimes describe the ones around the outer rim as being incremental, meaning we could look at how we're doing at selecting the best people to fit our culture, and we could make incremental improvements to get better. And we could look at our integration program, as I call it, in whatever form it might exist, and we could make incremental improvements to get better and so on. But the 2 things that we talked about in the middle, I don't think those are incremental. If we don't start by defining exactly what we want our culture to be, and I say define it in behavioral terms, we're just not going to be nearly as effective as we could otherwise be. Secondly, once we have that clarity, just go back to that last illustration, the only way our people are ever going to internalize those behaviors is when we teach it to them over and over and over and over and over and over again. And the only way that's ever going to happen with that much consistency, without us getting bored and quitting and doing something else, is when we bake them into rituals. That's why I do that drawing the way that I do. So we're just about at the top of the hour, but we got a few minutes for questions on anything about that I've talked about in general, or even specifically about your company. What else can I answer for you?
David, I'm just curious. I mean, I appreciate your work you're doing, and thank you so much for sharing your time and talents on all of this. What about what about metrics, right? I've got a board of directors that's looking for metrics on how do we measure this, Tammy? Like, how are we seeing, because we've done some new work, and how do we start to measure that? Do you have any quick, we have engagement scores, but is there anything that you're seeing today or tomorrow that might be relevant?
Yes and no. It's a good question you're asking, Tammy, and I hear it often. So what I would say, first thing I would say is there are things we can measure directly and some that are indirect. And so directly, we can look at things like engagement scores. We could look at turnover rates. We could look at I used to call it my first company, percentage recruiting wins. When we're recruiting somebody, how often they take our job. We could look at productivity. All of those are things that get the culture right, and it contributes to all of those things. They're not measuring the culture directly, but they're measuring the impact of the culture. Sure. Having said that, I'm also very cautious about that, because you also can't isolate the variables. If your engagement scores went up 30%, was that because you did this, or because you did 15 other things? Or if productivity was improved, was that because of this, or was it because you got rid of a stupid manager who stunk? There could be a whole lot of things that are contributing to that, and you can't hold all of those variables isolated and constant, and the only thing that changed is this. So I'm always wary about making lofty claims about that. But those are things that you can measure that are indicators of it. You could also do the survey that I described that actually measures, are we living to these things in a consistent way or not?
Thank you.
Yeah. Other questions?
Well, if you don't mind, do you ever stop a meeting because you just can't get the person to? We have a lot of talkers that, and we're not supposed to interrupt, is one of our things. sometimes you just have to interrupt and you got to get on to the next thing. So we may have made a mistake in our behaviors because we're now, regretting some of those things that we want to respect people to be heard. Everyone has a voice, but not everyone has a vote is kind of what we're. But that's backfired now that, well, then I want to speak, and then the meetings, only 15 people, but the meetings can get long and people don't want to be interrupted. So we've kind of made a mistake on that. How would you have us retract that?
Yeah, good question. So a couple things. First of all, if we're starting a meeting with a fundamental of the week, I always limit that to maximum 5 minutes. And the way that I do that is I'll say, the reason I do that, and then I'll show you the way. The reason I do that is if this is an hour sales meeting, we've allotted 5 minutes for the fundamental of the week, and we're now at 26 minutes, we're going to stop doing it after a while because it's eating up our time. So I don't want to do that. So the way that I cut it off is I'll say, this is great. I love how engaged you guys are. Love the conversation. We're going to move on to the rest of our meeting now. If any of you have a few minutes when the meeting's over, we can talk about it some more then. And then you can move on. And again, if anybody wants to still talk, they don't have to tie up everybody else. And that's how you move it on. Just another suggestion you can do in that. I mean, that's the most important thing. Another thing that I found, and I'll refer to this as just in general with meetings, is if you have a written agenda for the meeting, which ideally you do, if you assign time brackets to things, people tend to work inside of that. I remember being the head of the president of the board of a large nonprofit. And when I took over as the board chair, I started instituting, all right, we got 5 minutes on this, 10 minutes on this, 10 minutes on this. And people start to organize the conversation around the time allotted. If there's no time, it's just an item, it just goes and goes and goes. So that can make a difference in all meetings.
Thank you. I like those guardrails. That's good.
People start organizing inside of that. Other questions? Well, one thing I'll mention, and then a question for you. So my last book, Culture by Design, there it is, the second edition of Culture by Design, has everything we talked about in a lot more details. Like it was a full chapter on all of those things. So there's a lot more detail there. So you might check that out if you have not already. It's on Amazon and it's in all forms, and it's also audiobook version too, if you prefer to listen to books. So that is a resource. And our website, CultureWise, is a resource also. A lot of material there. And if we can help you do any of this, again, we've done this for over 800 companies. There's a best practice like you would expect for almost anything. So happy to help us, help you, just let us know. Question for you as we wrap up is, we're always interested in how people learn about us and our material. So Tammy, how did you come across us? How did we find you here today?
Yeah, well, actually, I joined the organization in February, and my CEO actually sent me over an email she had received, and then I've been following you ever since. So
great, super. And how about for Pam and Tim?
Our president and CEO, I think, heard you speak at one of his Vistage meetings.
Yep.
And he sent us the link. Tim and I are two members of we've had the group now for about a year and a half. We started like an ambassador group here at the company, and it involves aspects of every department, no matter the level of employee. And we've been kind of the spearheads behind that to try to keep that going consistently and getting it to grow into its own being. And so he sent that to us saying, I think you guys would benefit from this.
Great. Super. Well, it would be good to be able to help you do this. I work with hundreds of Vistage members. Yeah. And Brenda, how about for you?
Similar. So the founder is part of a Vistage group, and so a few weeks ago sent me some links to get started. So we're just starting stuff.
Good. Yeah. Super. Well, if we can help any of you to take it to a deeper level, let us know. We'd be happy to do that. That's what we do with lots and lots of people. Well, great to spend time with you. And again, reach out if there's questions that I can answer. And we'll send out the recording for you as well, in case you want to share that with somebody else too. Super.
Sounds
All right.
great. Thank you so much,
Yeah.
David.
You're very welcome. My pleasure. All
Thank
right.
you.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.
You too. Thank you.
Thanks.